Hey there, welcome back to Talestrum. Today's story is one of injustice, determination, and the power of family. Imagine serving your country overseas, only to return home and discover your house has been stolen, legally, through a system designed to protect homeowners. But what happens when someone refuses to accept that injustice? This is the story of one man's fight to reclaim what was wrongfully taken. Let's dive in. HOA illegally auctioned off my deployed brother's house, and I made them pay. My name is Logan Carter, and this is the story of how my brother's house was stolen while he was serving overseas, and how I fought to get it back. Before I jump into all the twists and turns, let me give you a bit of context about who we are and how we ended up in this mess. My brother, Logan Carter, has always been the type to step up when others would step back. He was the kid in our neighborhood who'd help old Mrs. Richardson carry her groceries up the stairs, even if it meant missing the start of his favorite TV show. He'd mow the lawn for folks who couldn't manage it, refusing payment with a grin and a shrug. "Gotta take care of each other," he used to say. That sense of duty never left him. By the time he was in high school, Logan already knew he wanted to join the military. He felt it was his calling, something bigger than himself. A chance to serve his country and protect the freedoms he cherished. After graduation, he went straight to basic training. There was never a doubt in my mind that he would give it everything he had. Over the years, he rose to the rank of sergeant in the Army, earning multiple commendations for exemplary service. Despite the risks, Logan remained humble. He rarely spoke about the difficulties of deployment, only mentioning how proud he felt to wear the uniform. He would talk about his fellow soldiers like they were family. And in some ways, they were bound together by experiences most of us can't even begin to imagine. Eventually, after careful planning and saving, Logan bought a modest two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't the biggest place in the world, just 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, and a cozy living room. But to Logan, it was a symbol of stability, a tangible reminder of the life he was protecting overseas. I still remember the day he closed on it. He called me from the porch, brimming with excitement. "Matthew, you won't believe it," he said, voice trembling with joy. "I've got the keys in my hand. This is our place now." He said our place even though I didn't live there, because that's how Logan is. Generous to a fault, always seeing his blessings as something to be shared. He even gave me a spare key and the garage code, joking that if I ever needed a place to crash, the door would always be open. I was proud of him, proud of the life he was building, proud of his dedication. Before he was deployed for what would be his next tour overseas, Logan made sure everything with the house was squared away. Mortgage payments were set to be automatically deducted from his bank account. His bills were paid well in advance. He gave me power of attorney, not because he expected any major issues, but so I could handle any minor hiccups in his absence. Maybe a repair needed or a piece of paperwork that required his signature. We both assumed it would be smooth sailing. He had a solid mortgage and the neighborhood was quiet. But life is strange. Sometimes the biggest storms come out of nowhere. And in this case, that storm hit the day I got a phone call from our mother. I can still picture exactly where I was. It was early evening, and I'd just gotten off work. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, scrolling through messages on my phone, when it started ringing. Mom's voice was trembling, something I'd rarely heard from her in all my years. "Matthew, they sold Logan's house," she told me. I could feel my heart slam against my ribcage. "What do you mean they sold his house?" The words got stuck in my throat, almost as if speaking them out loud made it more real and terrifying. "The HOA," Mom whispered. "They put it up for auction." There was a hollowness in her voice. At that moment, I didn't even know how to react. My mother isn't one to panic or exaggerate, so if she was scared, I knew the situation had to be dire. Without pressing her for details, I gripped my keys, started my car, and drove as fast as I legally could to Logan's house. In the back of my mind, I thought maybe this was some misunderstanding, a glitch in the system. After all, how could a house that was fully paid on a mortgage with no missed bills be sold? But as I turned onto Logan Street, an unsettling sight awaited me. My heart sank. I arrived to find a moving truck sitting blatantly in the driveway, its back panel rolled up, revealing a bunch of Logan's belongings. His furniture, his TV, his personal mementos. Strangers were hauling them out like they were just junk to be discarded. I saw the couch Logan bought after his first deployment, the entertainment system he'd carefully picked out, even the homemade wooden shelf that displayed his growing collection of military plaques and medals. To see them tossed around with no regard for their emotional value felt like a punch to the gut. Rage started boiling inside me. I could barely keep my composure as I parked behind the moving truck and jumped out of the car. That's when I saw her standing on the porch. Samantha Turner, the HOA president. I recognized her immediately because Logan once mentioned she was the sort of person who left critical notes on doors about trash bins not being taken in quickly enough. Samantha was the embodiment of every homeowners association horror story you've ever heard. Constantly nitpicking, imposing fines for the most trivial violations, and reveling in the power she seemed to wield over the neighborhood. I'd met her briefly when Logan first moved in, and we'd had a minor altercation about the color of his front door. She claimed it was an unauthorized shade of blue. That alone told me she was someone who liked control. But never in a million years did I think she, or any HOA, could manage to sell a service member's home out from under him. As I approached, I saw Samantha barking orders at the moving crew, pointing with her clipboard. She looked so self-assured, so certain of her authority. The sight of her face filled me with anger to the point that my hands trembled. I stormed up the front lawn, nearly stumbling over the rolled-up garden hose that Logan always kept by the porch. "Who the hell gave you the right to do this?" I practically roared, my voice hoarse with emotion. Samantha turned around slowly, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Carter, I was wondering when you'd show up," she said. The tone in her voice was condescending, as though she was explaining to a child why bedtime was non-negotiable. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. She glanced at her clipboard with an exaggerated sigh, as if scanning an official list. "This property was auctioned off last week due to unpaid HOA fees," she said, with that same smug expression. Unpaid HOA fees? That made no sense. Logan was meticulous with every bill, especially anything tied to his house. "My brother is deployed overseas," I said, my voice trembling between anger and desperation. "His mortgage is paid automatically. He owes you nothing." Samantha arched an eyebrow, flipping through pages with deliberate slowness. "Actually, he violated HOA policy by leaving the house unoccupied for over 6 months without filing the required absence paperwork. That's considered abandonment under our rules." I felt my jaw clench so hard it hurt. "Abandonment?" I repeated, the word tasting foul. Logan wasn't some deadbeat homeowner who disappeared. He was overseas risking his life. He's fighting for this country, and you're stealing his house over some technicality? Samantha's lips twisted into a smug grin. "The law is the law," she said coldly, as if that absolved her of any moral responsibility. I spotted a police officer standing nearby, watching, but not intervening. I turned to him, practically begging. "You're just going to let this happen?" I asked, voice cracking with raw emotion. "This is theft." He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "It's a civil matter, sir," he replied. "If you have an issue, you'll need to take it to court." That's when the reality hit me. This wasn't just some clerical error or minor violation. It was a deliberate scam. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were exploiting the system and had the audacity to do it in broad daylight. I left Logan's home that day seething, my mind consumed with questions and outrage. On the drive back, every scenario ran through my head. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew. This was a plot, orchestrated by Samantha and whoever else in the HOA had the power to support her. And if they thought they could get away with it just because Logan was on the other side of the world, they were sorely mistaken. Furious and determined, I went home and immediately started combing through every piece of paperwork I had access to. I spread out bank statements, HOA documents, mortgage statements, and Logan's military deployment records across my dining table. Sleep wasn't an option. My entire focus narrowed down to one goal: expose what they'd done and take back Logan's house. I made calls to the mortgage company to verify that all payments were indeed up to date. They confirmed that not a single payment had been missed. I checked Logan's billing history, electric, water, internet, and saw everything had been settled without any gaps. Then I turned to the HOA documents, reading every line of fine print, scanning for any clause that might justify this so-called auction. That's when I started noticing a pattern: repeated fines for nonsensical violations. For instance, the HOA claimed that Logan's lawn was neglected. But Logan had hired a landscaping service that continued to maintain the yard every 2 weeks. Another fine stated that his military-approved security system was unauthorized surveillance equipment, despite the fact that many other neighbors had the same brand of system installed. Then came the biggest bombshell. According to federal law, specifically the Service Members Civil Relief Act, you can't just foreclose on an active-duty service member's property without following very stringent procedures. Among those procedures is a requirement to notify both the service member and their mortgage company. There are also caps on interest rates and protections against default judgments. The more I read, the clearer it became that the HOA had blatantly ignored these protections. They never even tried to contact Logan or the mortgage company. Adding to the stench of corruption was the fact that the buyer at the auction turned out to be Samantha Turner's cousin. So not only did they claim to have a legitimate foreclosure, but they also managed to sell the house, at a fraction of its value, to a family member of the HOA president. It was a textbook inside job. The deeper I dug, the more furious I became. It was like peeling back layer after layer of a rotten onion. Each new discovery only made me angrier and more determined. How many other homes might they have done this to, especially those belonging to military personnel who weren't around to defend themselves? Exhausted, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, I realized I needed professional help. I started calling lawyers in the area, explaining the situation. Some were sympathetic but said it would be an uphill battle. Others were honest about their fees, which were astronomical. I was close to hitting a wall when a friend recommended an attorney with a reputation for championing underdogs against corrupt HOAs, Adrian Callahan. Adrian's office was in a nondescript building on a quiet street. Inside, his workspace was cluttered with towers of legal books, boxes of case files, and half-empty coffee cups. The man himself was in his mid-40s, with slightly disheveled hair and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. He wore a rumpled suit that looked like it had seen better days, and on his desk sat a coffee mug with the bold text, "Sue first. Ask questions later." He greeted me with a firm handshake and gestured for me to sit. Without wasting time, I laid out everything I knew. The suspicious fines, the lack of proper notifications, the SCRA violations, and the obvious conflict of interest with Samantha's cousin buying the house. Adrian listened intently, jotting down notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his creaking office chair, tapping his pen against the pad. "This isn't just bad," he finally said. "It's illegal as hell." Those words flooded me with relief and validation. It wasn't just me who saw how wrong it was. Adrian explained that the Service Members Civil Relief Act is incredibly strict about protecting deployed personnel from these exact scenarios. They can't just bulldoze over a service member because they're deployed, he said. The courts do not look kindly on that. He immediately set the wheels in motion. He filed an emergency injunction to stop the property transfer from going any further. This would freeze any sale or changes to the property's deed until a judge could review the case. I was eager to deliver the paperwork in person, partly because I wanted to see Samantha's reaction. So, I found myself marching into the HOA's office, an unassuming building where Samantha presumably reigned over her fiefdom. The receptionist tried to block me, but I was in no mood for polite formalities. I placed the injunction papers on Samantha's desk with more force than necessary. "See you in court," I muttered, meeting her gaze. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of uncertainty in her eyes. She tried to maintain that smug composure, but her voice wavered ever so slightly when she replied, "You have no idea what you're getting into." Oh, but I did, and I wasn't backing down. Realizing that legal action was only one piece of the puzzle, I decided to make as much noise as possible. I reached out to military advocacy groups and veterans organizations, sharing the full story of what the HOA was trying to do. People were outraged. The idea that a service member could have his house legally stolen while deployed struck a nerve across the board. Within days, word began to spread. Local journalists picked up the story first, running headlines like, "Deployed Soldier's Home Allegedly Seized by HOA." Then regional news outlets caught wind of it, and before I knew it, national organizations were calling me. I found myself doing interviews, holding up copies of the bogus fines, explaining how the HOA orchestrated the fraudulent foreclosure, and emphasizing that no one from the HOA or the mortgage company had tried to notify Logan or me, despite the power of attorney. Social media caught fire. People from all over the country, especially veterans and military families, bombarded the HOA's online pages with criticism. Politicians began to take notice, with some even releasing statements condemning the actions taken against my brother. Felt surreal. One moment, I was just an angry brother fighting a corrupt association in a suburban neighborhood. The next, I was at the center of a nationwide conversation about protecting the rights of deployed service members. A few of my interviews even went viral, prompting people to rally behind Logan. The day I saw Logan's story trending on social media felt both heartening and heartbreaking. Heartening because I knew we had an army of supporters behind us, people who wouldn't stand for the injustice. Heartbreaking because Logan was still halfway around the world, likely unaware of the storm unfolding at home. All I could do was pray that he was safe and that he'd eventually come back to find his home, and not just an empty lot or a locked door. Amid the media frenzy, I received countless messages from other military families who had experienced HOA harassment, though none quite as extreme. Some were forced to pay massive fines for petty violations, while others had faced threats of foreclosure. My inbox became a repository of horror stories, a testament to how power can be abused by those in positions of authority. But it also fueled me. The more stories I heard, the more determined I became to win, not just for Logan, but for everyone who'd ever been bullied by an unscrupulous HOA. If we could set a precedent, maybe we could stop this from happening to another family. As the court date loomed, Adrian and I spent countless hours compiling evidence. Every screenshot, every fine, every invoice, every piece of documentation relating to Logan's deployment was meticulously organized. Adrian liked to say, "Court isn't just about being right. It's about showing you're right," so we gathered 1. Bank statements, proving Logan's mortgage payments were up to date. 2. Deployment orders, confirming Logan was on active duty overseas, protected under federal law. 3. HOA correspondence, showing the timeline of suspicious fines, including ones that directly contradicted known facts, like the landscaping fees. 4. Auction records, highlighting the purchase by Samantha Turner's cousin at a below-market price. 5. Witness statements, neighbors who were willing to testify they never saw any official notices posted, and that they'd observed the landscaping company regularly maintaining Logan's yard. Meanwhile, Samantha and her group tried to push back through their own lawyer. They argued that the HOA was following state guidelines regarding abandoned properties. They claimed they had mailed notices to Logan. But Adrian was quick to point out that not only had we never received any notices, but they also failed to notify the mortgage holder, which is a glaring violation under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Even the police officer who had been present during the initial confrontation noted in a statement that he was only there because the HOA requested assistance with a property eviction, not because Logan or I had broken any laws. The entire scenario was riddled with half-truths and manipulative tactics designed to push through a fraudulent sale. As the day of the hearing approached, I could feel the tension growing. I saw it in the anxious lines on my mother's face and in the long phone calls with relatives who wanted updates. In my quiet moments, the stress would hit me like a wave. I'd wonder, what if we somehow lost? What if the court sided with the HOA on some bizarre technicality, and Logan really lost his house? But every time I thought about giving in to worry, I reminded myself of who Logan was. This was the man risking his life in a combat zone. The least I could do was fight with everything I had back home. And if that meant battling a corrupt HOA to the very end, so be it. The day finally arrived, and it felt as though the entire community was watching. The courthouse was bustling with reporters, veterans wearing their service caps, and neighbors who had come to support us. Some were simply curious onlookers drawn by the media coverage. Inside the courtroom, every seat was taken. The gallery was filled with supporters, military families, local residents, and friends I hadn't seen in years. It was surreal to see such a massive turnout. Standing at the front with Adrian by my side, I tried to steady my nerves. My palms were sweating, my heart pounding so loud I half expected the bailiff to call for order. On the other side of the courtroom was Samantha Turner, flanked by her attorney, along with a couple of other HOA board members. Samantha was dressed in a crisp suit, her hair styled neatly, but she kept shifting in her seat, unable to project the same smug confidence that she'd shown on the day she auctioned off Logan's house. I caught her glancing around the courtroom, likely unsettled by the outpouring of support for Logan. The judge entered, a no-nonsense figure who wasted no time getting down to business. After calling the court to order, he looked over the case details. Adrian stood to present our argument, systematically laying out the evidence. 1. The illegal foreclosure, failure to notify both the service member and the mortgage lender, which is in direct violation of federal protections. 2. The questionable auction. The property was sold under suspicious circumstances to a relative of the HOA president, for a price far below market value. 3. Fabricated HOA violations. The numerous fines and abandonment claims, many of which contradicted the evidence of regular maintenance and the house's security system. The judge asked pointed questions, flipping through the file as Adrian spoke. Then it was the HOA's turn. Their lawyer tried to argue they had followed state law regarding unoccupied properties, claiming they had no knowledge Logan was on active military duty. But we had logs of emails between Logan and the HOA from before his deployment, where he explicitly mentioned his upcoming service. We also had copies of the power of attorney documents that were sent by certified mail to the HOA's offices. Each argument they attempted was met with well-documented counterpoints. Adrian made sure there was no wiggle room for them to manipulate the narrative. At one point, Samantha tried to speak up, saying, "Your Honor, the HOA's regulations clearly require that," but the judge cut her off, his face stern. "I'm fully aware of what the HOA's regulations may say. However, the Service Members Civil Relief Act supersedes state and local regulations when it concerns the rights of active duty personnel." He then turned to the HOA's lawyer. "Your client appears to have knowingly neglected federal law. That is a serious matter." A hush fell over the courtroom. You could practically feel the tension radiating from Samantha. She kept her gaze fixed on the table in front of her, her knuckles white against the polished wood. Finally, after hours of back and forth, the judge delivered his decision in a clear, firm tone. Given the evidence presented, it is clear that the foreclosure and subsequent sale of this property were conducted illegally, in violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. The foreclosure is hereby declared null and void, and ownership is restored to Sergeant Logan Carter. Furthermore, this court orders a full investigation into the HOA's practices, particularly those related to fines, foreclosures, and auctions. A wave of relief washed over me so powerfully that I nearly sank to my seat. Reporters in the back scrambled to record the outcome, camera shutters clicking. The veterans present murmured in approval, some even letting out subdued cheers before the bailiff reminded them to maintain decorum. As for Samantha, she looked pale, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. Her lawyer patted her arm, whispering something that presumably amounted to, "We're done here." With the court's decision in our favor, the investigation into the HOA began almost immediately. What they found was far more extensive than even I had imagined. It turned out that Samantha and certain members of the board had been conducting fraudulent foreclosures on various properties for years. They would identify homeowners who were away for long periods, be it for extended travel, medical reasons, or in Logan's case, military deployment, and aggressively levy fines for manufactured violations. When those fines went unpaid, often because the homeowner wasn't aware of them, they'd initiate foreclosure proceedings. Then, using their inside connections, they'd auction off the property at a fraction of its true market value to friends and family. It was a well-oiled scheme. Some victims never even realized how deeply they'd been cheated until it was too late. Many didn't fight back, either because they lacked the resources or because they felt overwhelmed by the complicated legal process. But our case, bolstered by Logan's military status and the national attention it garnered, shone a glaring spotlight on all of it. Samantha was forced to resign her position as HOA president. Soon after, she faced a barrage of criminal charges, including fraud and illegal foreclosure practices. The rest of the HOA board members who had colluded in these scams were similarly exposed. Some claimed they were merely following her lead, but the investigations revealed emails and meeting minutes where they openly discussed their strategy. In the weeks that followed, multiple lawsuits were filed by other homeowners who realized they, too, had been targeted. The new, interim HOA board scrambled to rectify these past wrongs. But the damage had already been done. The association's reputation was in shambles, and the legal repercussions for those involved were severe. For Logan's part, once the court declared the foreclosure null and void, it restored his rightful ownership of the house. But that was just the beginning. There was the matter of the personal belongings that had been removed and damaged, the emotional distress, and the legal costs. By the time everything was settled, Logan received not only his home but also a significant sum in damages. The judge wanted to make it very clear that violating the rights of a deployed service member would carry steep consequences. Throughout this ordeal, I found myself at the center of a community transformed. Neighbors began to question how much power we give to homeowner associations. Some members admitted they had blindly trusted the board, signing off on proposals without reading the fine print. Others felt regret for not standing up sooner when they suspected something was off. In a strange way, the crisis brought the neighborhood together. A new sense of vigilance emerged. People realized it was their responsibility to ensure transparency, fairness, and oversight in any organization that governed their homes. After months of battling in court, gathering evidence, and dealing with media attention, the day finally came for Logan to return from his deployment. I remember driving to the airport to pick him up, my stomach a knot of anticipation and excitement. Part of me worried about how he'd react to the chaos that had unfolded. Would he be furious at the HOA? Would he be disappointed in me if I hadn't been able to fix it? But as I pulled up to his house, I realized I wasn't the only one eager to welcome him. A small crowd of neighbors and friends had gathered in the driveway, waving flags and holding signs. Some had banners that read, "Welcome home, Sergeant Carter." Others clapped and cheered. Several veterans stood off to the side, saluting as soon as Logan stepped out of my car. It was one of the most heartfelt scenes I've ever witnessed. Logan looked around, blinking in surprise. He saw the signs, the flags, the beaming faces of the neighborhood folks. He turned to me, his expression a mixture of awe and gratitude. "You guys did all this?" he asked, dropping his duffel bag on the lawn. "I expected a mess. Not this." I shrugged, trying to hide the lump in my throat. "We just wanted to show you how much you're appreciated," I said. "And yeah, about that mess. I took care of it." Logan pulled me into a tight hug, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had happened while he was gone. A simple gesture that spoke volumes. When we broke apart, the crowd converged, shaking Logan's hand, patting him on the back, thanking him for his service. We walked into the house together. Though the furniture had been rearranged a bit, much of it was put back by neighbors who insisted on helping. It still felt like home. There were fresh flowers on the kitchen counter, courtesy of the family across the street. A new set of family photos hung in the living room, gifts from me and Mom to replace the ones that had been damaged or lost. Logan took it all in, eyes lingering on the carefully restored photo of our late father, who was also a military man in his day. Then he turned to me, shaking his head in disbelief. "I heard rumors. I got bits and pieces. But I never expected this level of corruption," I offered, and he nodded. "And kindness," he added, gesturing to the neighbors who were still milling around, sipping on the lemonade someone had brought over. The fact that so many people came together like this is humbling. We spent the rest of the day talking, filling him in on the details, how the HOA tried to claim the house was abandoned, how they rushed the foreclosure, how we uncovered the scam, and how the community rallied behind us. At one point, Logan excused himself to the backyard, needing a moment alone. I watched from the window as he stood there in uniform, surveying the grass that had been carefully maintained in his absence. Later that evening, after most people had gone home and the day's excitement started to wane, Logan and I sat on the porch, sipping on cold drinks. The sun was setting, painting the sky a warm orange hue. It was the same porch where, months earlier, strangers had removed his belongings in a sham foreclosure. Now it felt like a place of peace and victory. "You really pulled this off," he said quietly. I couldn't help but smile. "Told you I had your back," I replied, my voice catching slightly. In the weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood began to stabilize. A new HOA board was elected, people who made transparency and fairness their priorities. They invited residents to monthly meetings, posted budgets and decisions online, and encouraged open dialogue. The sense of fear or apprehension that some neighbors had felt around the old HOA leadership slowly dissipated. People began to trust each other more, checking in on homes if they knew the owners were away, to ensure something like this never happened again. Logan settled back into civilian life, taking some well-earned leave to decompress. He spent time with our mother, who was overjoyed to have him safe and back in his home. The lawsuit concluded in our favor, and Logan used part of the compensation to help repair or replace any items that were lost or damaged. He also made donations to a couple of military support organizations that had reached out during our battle, wanting to give back to those who helped amplify his story. As for me, I found a new sense of purpose. The fight for Logan's house showed me how easily systems can be manipulated and how important it is to stand up for what's right, even if you're just one person. I considered going into advocacy work, helping other service members who might find themselves in similar predicaments. Adrian encouraged me, saying I had a knack for it. And Samantha Turner? She wasn't just removed from her position. She ended up facing several lawsuits and criminal charges. The courts froze her assets, and she spent a significant amount of time tangled in legal proceedings. Last I heard, she moved away, presumably to start over somewhere else without the constant reminder of her downfall. I can't deny there's a part of me that feels a grim satisfaction knowing she had to face consequences for her actions. But mostly, I'm relieved for Logan, and for everyone else who might have become a victim of that corrupt system. This whole ordeal taught me that while the law can be slow and imperfect, it can still be an instrument of justice if wielded correctly. It also showed me the power of collective outrage and support. When an entire community, both online and offline, comes together to say enough is enough, change is not only possible, it's inevitable. And that's the story of how Matthew Carter fought not just for his brother's house, but against an entire corrupt system, and won. It's proof that one person's determination can take down even the most crooked institutions. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Talestrum.